You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast presented by Trodden. Trodden is the world leader in at-home wine preservation, allowing you to pour a glass of your favorite wine and enjoy more bottles in your cellar without ever having to pop the cork. As always, I'm joined back in studio by Billy Galanko, who is in sunny LA in front of a Picasso or Monet, it looks like behind him.
Yeah, it's a wannabe Monet. It's a photo, but it's of beautiful wildflowers. Yeah, no, we're doing well here after an earthquake yesterday struck very close to home, so that was intense. But yeah, it's been a great little wine weekend here. We got a little tasting up by a Frank Lloyd Wright house here that they do on a Friday night, so that was really fun. And yeah, it's beautiful summertime.
Very cool. You had the earthquake, did it rattle any of your wine, or did you not feel it? Was it not one?
No, it was definitely one of the most felt ones I've ever had in my 6 years here. It was very, very shaky. I think they said it was shallow, and like the epicenter was like 2 miles from my house, or maybe not two, a little bit more, but very close.
Wow.
So we had one a couple weeks ago that kind of like rolled the house a bit. That was more fun. This one was slightly disconcerting because it kind of kept going. And you were like, oh, so
Yeah. The only ones here on the East Coast we've ever had just sounds like a really big truck is going by for like a minute outside is what it feels like.
wow, that's pretty intense. But yeah, speaking of earthquakes, you could kind of say our guest today's first book on orange wine was an earthquake, I guess, in the wine world.
Yeah, that's right. Or that maybe I'm trying to think of, let's see, our volcanoes and earthquakes can be related, right? And so volcanic soil, these higher elevation wines, I don't know, trying to get there. But Simon J. Woolf, who is our guest today, gives us a deep dive on low intervention wine and tells a really cool story about his journey through the industry and to find his passion there.
Yeah, no, Simon is somebody I've wanted to speak with. I've actually been communicating with him for multiple years now to have him on the podcast. He runs a kind of his own wine publication platform called The Morning Claret. Used to be kind of just like a newsletter. It's now just a repository of his work. So since he is kind of a renowned wine author, both in books and in publications, it's a really cool spot to kind of just keep up on the world of wine. And he's really, like you mentioned, honed in on kind of natural wine, things that happen in that space, but it's more of not necessarily calling it natural or low intervention. It's kind of just shining a spotlight on people making wines of place, kind of making wines they tend to be more minimalistic fashion, but it's just high quality wines from different regions throughout the world and really shining that spotlight. So it's a really, really interesting interview.
Yeah, I mean, to distill down his thesis, I think it's sort of the only wines worth drinking are ones that can be identified with the place in which the grapes were grown, and I think that is a reasonable thesis. Certainly, plenty of us drink wines that have really no semblance of place to them, especially if you drink maybe a lot of more mass market wines, or even some wines from large, very well known producers who have a high bar for quality at their estate. Still can oftentimes, I think, fall into creating wines that are extremely monolithic in terms of their style, or they don't change vintage to vintage for whatever reason. It might be a decision that they make on the business front, and that may be well and fine. But I think Simon's thesis is that wines should always show where they're from, and if that wine changes year to year, so be it. That's sort of the project of the winemaker, to make the best of things, with whatever you're given. So fascinating to chat with him, and he has a lot of really philosophical, cool perspectives on wine.
Yeah. So before we dive in, I have a couple of his books here for everybody watching on YouTube. Here's Amber Revolution was his book. It came out years ago on orange wine. It was well before the orange wine kind of became a thing, before it was even like in a regular conversation among even wine folks, which is really cool. I've actually used these as amazing photos in here. I've actually used this as a kind of a guide when I was going to Slovenia. I did some tastings really just based on this. I ate at places he recommended in here. So that's a really cool book. It's one he's probably most known for. And he also has this other book called Foot Trodden. Again, you can see it on YouTube, about the wines of Portugal. And it's a little more recent and it's really interesting. He talks about it a bit in the podcast as well. It's written with Ryan Opaz, and he kind of really shines a spotlight on not only the unique native varieties from Portugal, but kind of the producers making wine in regions that you wouldn't really consider, or you may consider for like a holiday, but you didn't really know they were making wine nearby. So that was really cool. And I've also subscribed now to the Morning Claret, the paid version. He has a free version as well. But what's really cool there is he gives also the same level of recommendations that he's giving in both this Portugal book and the orange wine book, but for regions throughout the world. You can find kind of his recos for different winemakers, in like Austria, for example. So I highly recommend getting all of these resources. These are a couple wine books that I actually go back to regularly. There's a few that you read once and you kind of put down, or some that are just too referential and you barely ever use them. These are beautiful, beautiful photos and amazing books. So I hope everybody kind of gets a little bit of the info that is in these books through this interesting interview with him, because I think he's really also well spoken on his points of view on a lot of things as well.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, Simon was a great guest, and we hope to have him on again in the future. But before we get to the interview here, real quick, a word from our partner for this episode, Corvin. Remember, if you're looking to drink more wine from your cellar without worrying about wasting what you can't consume, one of the Corvin systems will be your best friend. You can visit corvin.com and use code VINT15 for 15% off your purchase of one of their devices. And if you're a member of the trade, visit trade.corvin.com for exclusive discounts on the range of products and accessories for home and work. And now here's our interview with Simon J. Woolf.
Hi, Simon. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hi, thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, no, this is as we mentioned in the intro, it's a long time. I've been hoping to have you on. I think we've been in touch for almost like 2 years from me asking you to come on. So I'm really happy you were able to make it happen. And yeah, could you give our guests a little bit of background from the horse's mouth about what you've been working on and what your real focus is in the world of wine these days?
Sure, yeah. So basically for the last 10, 12 years, I focused very much on the world of natural wine, which is and I treat that quite broadly, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that later. Yeah, I'm a writer basically, so I write, I communicate, I go and talk to people or give masterclasses, and sometimes it's tied a bit more closely to one of my 2 books, I'm sure we're going to mention, and sometimes it's more general, but basically, yeah, the whole developing picture of natural wine and organics, biodynamics, orange wine, that's what fascinates me, and that's what I like to have a conversation about, basically.
Awesome. So when you started kind of evangelizing some of the stuff, it was, 10 years ago. It was very much beyond, it wasn't in the zeitgeist and as much of the conversation as it is now. What really inspired you to kind of take that, was there a single wine? Were there a few wines where you were like, wow, the quality of this is just amazing. I really need to tell more people about this.
Yeah, I think it was a combination of things. I mean, I've always had a very deep-rooted belief that farming needs to get beyond chemicals and synthetics. So, right, from decades ago, to me, like anything I put in my body, anything I eat, anything I drink, if I can possibly find it produced from organic farming or better, then I'm much happier. So when I started getting really into wine, I would look for that to be the point of difference. So if I had 2 wines in front of me from, I don't know, from Bordeaux, and one had an organic certification on the back and one didn't, I'd choose the organic one, just as a matter of principle, really. And so then what happened, when I started getting into writing more professionally, and I started going to a lot more wine fairs and tastings in London, where I was living at the time, inevitably, because I was so focused on organic and biodynamic, I started encountering natural wines without even really knowing what they were at first. And it was quite mind-blowing, really. I think the thing for me was that I just realized I kept on tasting these wines, and that the energy of these wines just leapt out of the glass. And sometimes I thought, is this is something to do with biodynamics? Because I'm sure every time I have wine that says Demeter on the back, I'm just blown away by the clarity of it. So I think that was the starting point. And then obviously I got the message about natural wine and low intervention. I realized that for me is a really key part of my enjoyment in wine. Basically, the more you mess around with it and fuss over it, probably the less appealing I find it as a drinker, to generalize rather broadly. So I think it was these kind of things really that got me interested. And then, of course, I realized, especially 10 years ago, that a lot of this stuff was quite controversial. I had colleagues that they literally made fun of me and say, "Oh, that's Simon that drinks all that weird, really nonsense." And I had people asking me when I did the interview early on, they said, "Well, it's rising wine." And I was like, "Drink it. I like it, and I think it's delicious, and that's why I write about it." So yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and not only that weird, funky, cloudy stuff as a critique, but that critique has, you know, evolved a bit from that to, well, organic. What is organic? There are plenty of legacy producers who produce organic and have a label on the back, and so I think we have two sort of those competing devil's advocate positions that you hear in the space, right? Like, do that funky, cloudy stuff, and hey, this is a fake thing, right?
Yeah, I think definitely. But I think, again, I mean, that conversation has also changed a great deal over the last 10 to 15 years, because, and certainly, I mean, I remember when I was growing up, and my mum was like a real organics advocate. And back in in the 1980s, and then, by the late 1980s, I was just about getting old enough to drink wine. And my mum used to buy this organic wine. Terrible. It was disgusting, It's clearly made by hippies or communists or even
The
worse.
bathtub wine, yeah.
And and it just wasn't very good. But I think, so in a way, the idea of farming organically, that was the ideal 15, 20, let's say 30 years ago. And then thank goodness we've moved beyond that. We've broadened the conversation. We said, well, not only is it good not to be spraying noxious chemicals on your vineyards, but it's also actually matters what you do in the cellar too. So I think the conversation's moved on a lot, but now inevitably, as organic agriculture has become so much more mainstream than it was when I was growing up, yeah, now people poo-poo it. And I think, as you said, you have people who say, well, it's bullshit, it's just marketing. You also have people who say, well, it's not enough, actually. It's really just the starting point where we can start to have a conversation. It doesn't mean very much, but it is still certification, and it does tell me something as a consumer. If I see an organic symbol on a bottle of wine, I know that there is some care, there is some consciousness of farming. And if that's all the information I've got, it's the best place to start.
I have a two-pronged question. I guess I probably should ask it in just two questions, but one is, do you think, I feel like there's this term, like, biodynamic farming, natural. There's a lot of producers, like Brady was mentioning, that are really well known, that kind of follow a lot of these practices, at least, especially in the vineyards. I mean, even think, DRC is the famous, biodynamic producer, but then there's a bunch of like big names in the row, and there's big names all over the world that follow these that hadn't really publicized it before. Do you think that, like, I guess there's going to be a movement eventually for people to start understanding that, like, there's not a dichotomy between natural and quality. It's like there's always been this quality, and you've maybe been drinking them for years and you just didn't know that their practices are lower intervention.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely getting there. Actually, one thing that drives me mildly crazy is some of these very high profile producers, and you mentioned DRC. Another one is Ridge, by the way. Also Chateau Palmer, and many other estates in the Medoc these days. All of them are now a biodynamic, I think, and none of them puts it on the label. And that drives me crazy, because to me, you couldn't have a better advert for the importance of good farming than someone at that level advertising it on their back label. And they don't, because they're hung up, or their investors say, well, we don't want that. We don't want that nasty Demeter symbol there. We don't want people to think this is natural wine or something. So I think there is actually, yes, on the one hand, I think the message is getting out that the serious guys are farming like this, and they have been for a while. You've got like Anne-Claude Leflave, the late Anne-Claude Leflave in Burgundy. There's so many super high-end producers now that are not just organic, but even biodynamic. But I really wish they'd get behind it from a branding point of view as well, because I think it's really important for wine drinkers to know. It's really important for them to see, that's, whenever this symbol appears on the back of the wine, it's better, it's next level. But that message won't get out if you have these like super premium, super high-end fine wine producers not putting it on the label. So yeah, that's actually a bit of a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, and mentioned this sort of style, we refer to it as a style of farming, but until the introduction of, pesticide use and fertilizer use, commercial fertilizer didn't become super popular until like the early or mid 1900s, like 1930s, 1920s.
Mm-hmm.
And fertilizer in general wasn't super popular until like mid to late 1800s. And so all of farming before then, it wasn't like a style, it was just farming, right? This sort of organic or biodynamic approach to it, right? There are all kinds of practices that we've had to harken back to and draw on there. And so, yeah, it's certainly some of the talk is semantics, and some of it, like you said, has real value when you can actually set yourself apart from, maybe what's commonly done in the mass market.
Yeah, well, I think the way I look at it is farming, and especially, maybe if we just talk about viticulture for now, so it's not too broad, but viticulture really lost its way by the 1960s, 1970s. People got so enthralled with the idea that, we don't have to do any work anymore. We can just spray herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and synthetic fertilizers, and we don't actually have to do anything. All we have to do is rock up and harvest the grapes. And that was so destructive. And I think, people started realizing in the 1980s, a lot of people in Burgundy started realizing that they had dead soil, their premium asset. The most important thing, if you're a high-end winemaker, was something that they were literally destroying. So yeah, but I think, you're right. It's very much a sort of going back to tradition, and realizing that this kind of technology or synthetics driven revolution actually isn't very good when you want to produce a product, when you want to farm in a way that's sustainable for the long term, and you want to operate at the highest level, make something that expresses its sense of place.
Do you think, I don't know how to frame this properly, I guess, but like the geopolitics of, I guess, our more recent times have allowed kind of this expansion or access to some of these wines that maybe we didn't have before? I'm kind of thinking about like Slovenia and Georgia and places that maybe were making amazing wines for a long time, due to the people, the geopolitical situations. The West wasn't able to get them. They weren't even able to make the wines they wanted to. Do you think we're kind of coming into a renaissance that way, as well as like this climate change and better quality attributes coming into effect as well?
Oh, without doubt. If you look at all the countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, all the ex-Soviet countries in ex-Yugoslavia, yeah, of course. That was closed off to the Western world. It's not just that, actually. It's not just that we didn't have access to the wines. People in those countries actually had to regain ownership of their land. So you had land that was taken away by the regimes of the time, and then in some cases, for example, if I think of Slovakia or Czechia, I mean, there are families there that didn't get their land back until the mid 2000s, as recently as that. So yeah, I think we do have a renaissance now, and we're able, the sheer variety of wine that we're able to enjoy from so many countries is extraordinary.
Well, in that same vein, do you think, I guess, due to their lack of resources or just being driven by the government to produce, volume during all those years, they maybe weren't as impacted by all this technology that was available to all the other winemakers who maybe went way too far. Maybe now that they're kind of like going back to what they wanted to produce the whole time rather than being dictated on what they had to grow and styles they had to make.
Yeah, I think it's definitely elements of that. Actually, probably the best example of that I know is probably Portugal, because Portugal was a country that had a very authoritarian regime until 1973. It was largely locked away from the rest of Europe. And although that had huge downsides for the population, it did have this sort of unexpected advantage that it probably helped to preserve indigenous grape varieties and old winemaking techniques much more effectively. At the same time, I think I definitely see a pattern always with a winemaking nation. There's a given point when it wakes up and gets connected to the outside world, and then usually the first thing that happens is that they go through a few decades of everybody wants to make French wine, basically. Everybody wants to use new oak barriques. They plant Cabernet Sauvignon, and they have to get that out of their system before they can actually move on and start getting back to something that has some authenticity to it. So we've seen that happen in countless Italian regions. We've seen it happen all over Central and Eastern Europe. You take a really up and coming wine country like Moldova. I think they're still a bit in their new oak and Cabernet Sauvignon phase, but I hope they'll come out of it at some point. So yeah, I think this is a cycle that most winemaking countries and regions go through. It's kind of they have to go through that cycle as a way of maturing and rediscovering what they're actually about.
Cool. I didn't know if Brady wanted to hop in there.
Go
No,
home, Jesse.
so I was just gonna say that's
You're
a nice
right.
a little bit of a segue, because you wrote a book about Portugal, and I think I actually came about it in a roundabout way. We had gone to Portugal a couple of years ago, kind of just the standard southern trip down to the south, went to Lagos, and then a little bit of time in Lisbon. Then we went over to Madeira because I had always wanted to go to Madeira. But when I was in Lisbon, so I had long ago converted my girl, or now wife, wow,
You
to
better get used to that.
yeah, it's short. But to liking like natural wine. She really didn't drink any wine when we first met, and that's about 6 years ago now. And then she went through a phase where she said, I only drink unfine, unfiltered wines. And I was like, that's fine. But we've come full circle. But while we were in Lisbon, she's like, oh, I found this cool natural wine bar. And when we went there, that was the first time I had some Luis Pato and some of his, I think his daughters, Felipe Pato's wines as well. And then they showed us a bunch of other cool things, and that really opened my mind, because I didn't know. People think about Portugal, and even when they think about new wines in Portugal, they're thinking maybe better Vinho Verde coming out, still wines coming from the Douro. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of like the really broad, just, I know it's a lot to do in like just a little bit, but the broad range of wines that are coming out of Portugal, and maybe a couple things for people to kind of look for. Maybe it's varieties they might not have heard of, or styles that they might not be aware of.
I mean, sure. I mean, I think that the thing about Portugal is it's although it's a very small country, but it actually spans a really wide range of climatic zones. You mentioned Vinho Verde, which is one of the wettest wine regions in Europe. It's like, I forget what it is. It's something like 1,600 millimeters of rain a year. It's insane. And then as you make your way down the country, I mean, you get to warmer parts, you get to more mountainous parts. So, I mean, to me, that's really interesting. I think the other thing, as you mentioned, if we talk about grape varieties, actually, many regions in Portugal, it's really not about the variety. It's much more about the field blend. This really old idea of planting everything together in the vineyard, harvesting it together, vinifying it together. And to me, some of the oldest vineyards and some of the most magical wines, actually, it really isn't important what the grape variety is at all. I think that's a challenge sometimes for people to get to grips with, but it's definitely something you do have to get to grips with to enjoy Portuguese wine. If you go somewhere like the Dow, for example, it's a more mountainous part of Portugal, south of the Douro. I mean, there are just extraordinary vineyards, 125 years old there. No one's got any clue what half of what's growing in there. But those vineyards have achieved a kind of equilibrium that you will just never get with 10 or 20-year-old single varietal plantings. So I think that fascinates me. I'm fascinated by people now realizing that you can make so many different styles of wine in the Douro. People get it into their head that Douro is about big, heavy reds, and I love tasting the wines of, I don't know, someone like Tiago Sampaio, who makes the wines under the label Wivo. He's got vineyards at 700 meters. Sorry, you'll have to translate that into feet. I find that impossible to do. And he's just making these delicate, fresh wines, and it confounds people. It's not their idea of the Douro, so I find that really fun. Personally, I find it super interesting to see what's going on in the Lisbon region, which actually stretches for, must be 150 kilometers north of the city, I think. That's a very interesting region because it was kind of under the radar for so long, and it was a region that had completely destroyed its reputation by producing bulk wine for Portugal's ex-colonies in Africa and so on. And what that's meant, though, is that there's an opportunity now for young winemakers there. And there are vineyards you can find to rent or buy. There is land available, whereas in some other parts of Portugal, in the Douro, it's much harder. So I think Lisbon, for me, is super exciting region. There's lots of up-and-coming producers there, lots of interesting stuff going on. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but so, yeah, I think Portugal, for me, there is a phenomenal variety of winemaking, but always with a slant to it. Either they're field blends or people are using the Portuguese amphoras, the tallias, or people foot treading. There are always little details that are still much more common there than they are in many other European countries.
Do you see a lot of instances, either there in Portugal or, just, I was asking generally around the world, where winemakers are coming in and identifying, now wild vineyards that have been around for, 50 to 100 years, and staking a claim in that way, and, sort of bringing it up to production again and going the biodynamic route there. I guess the underlying question is, how important do you think it is to, when we identify those vineyards, to maybe not mess with it too much, or to, how much is there work in terms of work to do to bring those vineyards back up to snuff? And do you see that happening a lot?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot. I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of abandoned vineyards where people just gave up because the financial reward for working them was so small. You have Portugal's a country where you have people selling grapes for, in some regions, as little as 25 or 30 cents a kilo of grapes. But I think I've heard so many stories, though. I've heard there's a beautiful story of a guy who makes wine in Lisbon, actually, in Ubidos is the sub-region, and he discovered a 300-year-old vineyard when he was walking around, and he thought it was a patch of weeds at first because the weeds were higher than he was, and then he realized there were vines actually nestling within the weeds, and he could see that some of the vines were still alive. So he then spent months trying to track down the owner, and he had a few false starts. He eventually found the owner, and after a process, she agreed that he could work the vines and use the grapes. She didn't want any money. She was just, her husband was long dead, and she was happy if he did it. So he brought that vineyard back to life. And the thing is, he's done it in a way which I really like. Actually, he's been super respectful of it. He harvests everything together, and he realized that it was a mix of white and red varieties. So he decided that he would use it to make what in Portugal they call a palhete, so which is a white red blend. So what the Spanish would call claret, maybe. So he harvests everything together, ferments everything together, and he says, yeah, this is what this vineyard is. This is what it's got. So I'm not gonna make any decision as a winemaker about the type of wine I'm going to try and get from it. I'm just going to let the vineyard give me what it's got, basically. So I love stories like that, and to be honest, that wine is always stunning. He has colleagues who are making wine in a similar low intervention way, and also making paliettes, and none of theirs ever quite has the nuances that his has. I think that's to do with the vineyard. Gerald vines they give you something magical. I guess it's like people. We maybe get a bit more difficult as we get older, but we get more interesting too. Hopefully, we've got more stories to tell.
Who is that producer, or is it only findable if we go?
The producer's called Chinado, so Chinado. Yeah, the guy's name is João Teresa. He gets a brief mention in my book, Trodden.
Cool.
But actually, when I wrote the book, I hadn't been to his place, so I wasn't able to tell the whole story.
Nice. Well, I will try to find some.
Yeah.
And on the note of just varieties in general being either less important or obscure, or not obscure, but lesser known, less mainstream varieties becoming more accepted. I'm like I had mentioned to you before, I live in Los Angeles, so there's a bunch of these both traditional wine bars and like natural wine bars nearby. And I see a lot of young people at a lot of these places, and nobody's really asking the question about, is this the cab? Is this a Merlot? They're asking either the story about the producer or like, how does this wine taste, regardless of what is in it. And I see people drinking all of these, really strange, obscure wines that I wouldn't have maybe 10 years ago. People that are, in their 20s or 30s, like my age. Have you seen this as a trend in general, kind of increase this acceptance of some of these lower intervention wines and more, wines from different parts of the world?
I think it's definitely a generational shift, and a very welcome one, I might add. So yes, I see this here in Amsterdam where I live, and I see it I think it's a big city thing in general. I think it takes longer for restaurants and wine bars out in the countryside or whatever. It takes longer for them to get people on side. But yeah, I think a younger generation of wine drinkers, of course, doesn't want to be drinking the same stuff that their parents were drinking. And I think that's one of the things I really love about natural wine. There are things that frustrate me, even though I'm a fan. But I like the fact that it's made the whole experience feel a bit fresher and a bit less, tied to this kind of fusty image that maybe came from wine labels that looked a certain way, or even wines that tasted a certain way. So yes, I do see this happening. Just what you were saying about familiar grape varieties and unfamiliar regions, though, I think there is something else happening here, which is maybe ironic or maybe even negative. And there is a big problem for natural wine and low intervention producers that they're often making wines that don't fit into appellations. So the wines end up being bottled as table wine. If it's France, they end up being bottled as Vin de France. If it's Portugal, they end up being bottled as IVV. And often they're not allowed to write the grape variety on the label. They may not even be allowed to write the region on the label. And so I think what that means is now you have a natural wine consumer, maybe as you said, someone in their 30s or even younger, they're flying blind because the information on the label, all they've got is a brand name and maybe a country, maybe a region if they're lucky, but the winemaker's not allowed to put any other information there. So yeah, I think they end up buying based on recommendation or what the story behind the wine is, or the fact that the label looks cool. I can't say if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it's an effect to do with wine classification.
Yeah. I It's funny you say that. I haven't really thought about that, but I do find myself telling the servers at a lot of these bars what's in their like the wine because it's not on the label. Like I will ask them, they have no idea. So I look it up like on the producer's website, and then they come back and I end up telling them whether they want to hear it or not. Normally they don't really care, um, but I think that also plays a role though in lowering the barriers. Like people don't need to know what a standard, X variety tastes like. They're just like, cool, this wine is good. It's something I enjoy. And it has a cool story. It's, made from old vines in this place. I want to visit someday. So I think I think it's bad, but for people like, nerds like me, but I think it's also good, in a way, lowering the barrier. But if you want to seek out more of the similar type, I guess, yeah, it makes it more difficult.
No,
So,
I think I'm inclined to agree with you. I think that a lot of rubbish talks about varietals, and it kind of drives me crazy, especially when, well, you go to wine school and study, and everyone says, oh, Sauvignon Blanc smells, citrus fruits, gooseberries, or cat's paw. And of course, all the wines that you taste when you go to do a lot of wine school stuff tend to be quite commercial examples. And I know now, I didn't know decades ago. I know that a lot of that flavor and aroma profile is to do with winemaking choices. It's to do with the use of aromatic yeasts or cold fermentation. It's nothing to do with that grape variety. So I think in a way, if we can move beyond that and say, yeah, it's not the variety, it's, it's the place, the winemaker that matters. But that's very difficult, isn't it? Because we live in a consumerist society and everyone's latched on to grape variety as a way that wine can be sold. I wish it wasn't so, but it's become the way that wine is sold. Maybe that's going to change. Maybe now people buy a wine because it's called 19 crimes or it's called. Maybe we can.
Yeah. Well, I was about to comment that, it really depends on the sector of the market. And sometimes in the wine world, producers try to take on every tier of the market all at once. And so you have to, I think, decide, are we going for the consumer, retail market below, $20 a bottle or something like that? Or are we going for something more? And it's probably that lower tier where label design, name, the organic label on the back, these kinds of things probably, have a lot of sway or could have a lot of sway. Whereas, legacy consumers and collectors, who buy Ridge, maybe for instance, get a little nervous when you see an organic label, but maybe it plays really well in the lower market. I'm not sure. So I think there's some strategy involved for producers trying to, how do you position this, and instead of taking the whole market all at once.
I think, yeah. I mean, I think in a way it's kind of an impossible problem. People will always be scared of a product where there's so much choice. And I guess I can understand, when someone says, you go to a wine bar and they say, oh, I'll have a glass of the Sauvignon Blanc. And they have no idea, and they probably don't even care who made the Sauvignon Blanc. They just know if they ask for Sauvignon Blanc, they'll get something that they normally like. So it stops them having to worry about, well, I see a load of names that I don't recognize, that I probably can't even pronounce, and I have no idea what the experience is going to be. And then, yeah, so I think in a way it's a sort of impossible problem to solve. Yeah, I wish we could solve it, but we probably can't. I think you have to become a bit more nerdy and geeky when you want to get to the next level and you want to get to the good stuff.
Yeah. Well, Simon, I appreciate the time. I have to hop here for another meeting. Billy's going to stay on and continue the convo, but definitely
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Following up on that, I think this is a good segue into what you're primarily focused on right now in terms of your writing. Can we talk a little bit about the Morning Claret and how people can kind of use that as a resource for learning more about maybe like producers to look for, styles, just news, happenings in the world of natural wine?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've spent a lot of time over the last 10 years writing for magazines and for other people, publications online and off. But I finally got to the point at the beginning of this year where I thought I really should invest a bit more in my own site, because my career as a wine writer all started with my blog, themorningclaret.com. And then I kind of neglected that really as I started getting published in other places and writing books, and inevitably, it was a blog that wasn't bringing me any revenue. So I got to the point where I was only publishing 3 or 4 things a year on the site. And I thought that's a bit stupid, really, in this day and age. I could be having so much more freedom and so much more opportunity to write about the things that I really care about versus what I can get a magazine to commission. So that's why at the beginning of this year, I decided actually to move my site to a subscriber model. It's using Substack for anybody that knows what that means, which is I think is a great platform for writers like me. And yeah, it's been a revelation for me actually, because it allows me the freedom I can push out a lot more material. I can be a lot more reactive. So if there's a burning issue going on in the wine world, and the natural wine world especially, I can publish a piece about it within a week. Whereas, a magazine could take months before that piece sees the light of day. So yeah, so right now, actually, I'd say what I'm trying to focus on, because I feel like not enough people are focused on that. Most of what I'm writing on the Morning Cloud is opinion based. Sometimes it takes on a more journalistic edge when there's something that I think needs to be dug into. Often it's opinion based, because I think that's lacking a bit in the wine world. I think there's way too much of people publishing tasting notes and telling the same old story of a winemaker or a wine region, and it gets a bit boring, really. And I think actually commentary and opinion that is independent, so where I'm able to probe a bit and not just tell this sort of be happy joy story that most of the glossy magazines want. I think there's value to that, and that's what my readers would agree, really. So it's a slightly different experience than I think you can get anywhere else.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I was late to the game on subscribing on the paid level, but what I do love about there's so much to dig into. Number one, and number two, I love how you kind of have like not only your opinions, but you also have like recommendations for growers and producers to kind of look for. And what's interesting is if I have like almost every wine book that I can get my hands on, and everybody kind of recommends the same group of traditional producers, and they're all really good. But the only way I've really found to identify some of these cooler, more emerging small producers are to either go to the country or go to tastings at some of these local wine bars I have. But I think it's really interesting how you're able to kind of share your top 10, and I'm sure they change over time of different producers. Can you talk a little bit about how you identify those and pick the ones you want to share? Is
Yeah.
it ones you're currently drinking or just really into?
I mean, it's often. I mean, yeah, I think it's absolutely true. So I'm very discovery focused, because I get bored easily, and I also think that it's more interesting. I mean, once I've visited a winemaker a few times and enjoy drinking their wines, I sort of feel like they don't need my attention so much. So yeah, I'm very focused on discovering new things, and one of the key ways that I do that is going to wine fairs, basically going to natural wine fairs. So yeah, I think maybe you may have been referring to, I published a piece which was my top 10 new Austrian growers after I'd been to a couple of events in Austria back in May. And that really stimulates me, really, just finding emerging talent. And I think that it's really valuable and powerful to get that in front of people. And I think it's much more useful than going and retasting the new vintage of a winemaker that we all know well, who really don't need my attention. So yeah, that's basically my modus operandi. Is I discover new people at fairs, and then usually what I would do is I would follow up with them maybe the following year and try and visit them and go a bit deeper into the ones where I think there's something really special. I mean, inevitably what happens is I always have a backlog, and it shocks me, but sometimes if the stars don't align and I'm not in the right place at the right time, it takes me years sometimes to visit someone whose wines I've been loving and drinking. But sometimes I get lucky and I'm able to get to someone a bit quicker. Just depends.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's it's really nice to have another resource. There is a producer that I was actually just doing a tasting nearby us. It was, I think his wine label is Man mit Hut, or Man with Hat. Either that's his label or that's his Instagram handle. His name is Lucas Kraus. Um, and he produces wines in the Pfalz, and like I would never have found his wines probably otherwise. And then met him. They're amazing. And then I got connected with their importer, and we had them on the podcast to kind of like help people share more where to get those. But it's cool to have another resource from somebody who's so plugged in. Now, I guess there are also, as we get closer to the end here, 2 articles on there that you basically touched on 2 things that I've been trying to propound, I guess. That's not necessarily the word, but basically trying to share with people for a long time. And one has to do with orange wines, and we can save that for the end. But the other one is that Blaufränkisch, or as you put it in there, Blue Frank, which what I mean, might be the world's greatest red grape. I completely agree, and I well, not completely agree is the best, but I love it. And I've been trying to get more people to drink those wines, and even blends with that, and Zweigelt and all the other Austrian red grapes that have so much like energy as well as ability to age and depth. Can you talk a little bit about Blaufränkisch and why you made that assertion?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's I I remember like first discovering the variety. Really, I had my girlfriend of many years was Austrian, and we lived together in Austria for a year, and so I got a crash course in the variety because we were living in Burgenland, which is where most of it is. And yeah, it's just a variety that ticked all the boxes for me. I love nice fresh acidity. I love a bit of structure. I'm more than happy to have some tannins, and I just found this very sort of noble kind of dark cherry, sour cherry sort of character that it can have. I just found that really, really Moorish, really, really lip smacking. So it's a variety that I adore. I think I'm always a bit of a sucker when wines have this sort of quite thirst quenching, quite upfront acidity. Do like that very much. But I think that the issue with Blaufränkisch, as with so many varieties, it's easily obscured by the use of oak. So it's very easy to take it and bludgeon it into something flat and boring. And so for me, the best Blaufränkisch is usually when it's reasonably naked. If people are using oak, then they're subtle about it. And then I just think the fruit character is sensational. And of course, like any noble variety, it ages beautifully. And I've had wonderful Blaufränkisch at 10 or 15 years old, and more is possible with the top wines too.
Yeah, it's so great to see. Not that I was drinking wine back in the 80s when they had their the antifreeze issues, but it's really cool to see how Austrian wines have kind of bounced back. They become amazingly well I guess taken care of, full focus. Like basically the regulations have led to such careful winemaking over the years, and now they're kind of taking that attention to detail and like letting the land speak for itself, as well as just careful winemaking. And it's been cool to see, at least in my limited wine tasting career. Who are some of your top producers for Blaufränkisch wines that people maybe could look for?
Oh,
So that's to be
I mean,
maybe just some
think
favorites. Doesn't have to be the top. Yeah.
I mean, we have to mention Ernst Triebaumer. So it's not Ernst anymore, really. I mean, he's still walking the earth, but it's his 2 sons. The Triebaumer they were really the people that convinced the world that Blaufränkisch is a serious variety. They were the ones that really pushed it in the 80s and 90s. The Triebaumer for me is a reference point. Really stunning wines. The Marienthal is their top single vineyards cuvee. I love very much the wines of Uwe Schiefer in southern Burgenland. I think then you have people like Heinrich, Klaus Preisinger, Renner, and sisters, all making wonderfully vibrant, fresh styles. They're all biodynamic. I mean, Triebaumer is too, but they're not certified. What else could we mention? I'm sure there's so many others.
I'm a big fan of Morik Van.
Moritz,
Yeah,
yeah,
Moitz. Yeah, I knew I was
yeah,
always saying that wrong.
yeah.
Yeah, his
I'm
house
actually
wine.
Veiniger as well. Actually, yeah. If you talk about Moritz, another Mittelburgenland producer would be Franz Veiniger.
Hmm.
Um, if anything, I mean, he has vineyards on both the Hungarian and the Austrian side of the border because his estate it hugs the border. And if anything, I slightly prefer the wines that he's got on the Hungarian side of the border. So
Hmm.
technically it's Francosch, but same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, there's the people whose Blaufränkisch I prefer are always the people who are a little bit more puristic about it. As I say, not trying to overdo it, not trying to over oak it, not trying to harvest it too ripe or too extracted. And then I think it just responds so well, and it's so beautiful.
I think it would probably confuse people even more to add to switch the name that people want to focus on for Blaufränkisch. I mean, it has so many different, like Lemberger, Blaufränkisch, but I actually think the one for like the first time ever, the Magyar word that I actually prefer, I think Heckfränkisch is actually the cleanest way of saying Blaufränkisch out of all the
Okay.
possibilities. But normally Magyar is just so hard. I always just like
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah, no, it's actually, yeah, it's a reasonably straightforward Hungarian word. That's true. That's true. Yeah. I mean, they all mean the same. That's why I put Blue Frank just as a joke, really, because, that all of these things, Frankoka, Modera, Franquinha, they all mean the same. The Lemberger is the wild card.
yeah.
Why the Germans came up with such a name, we'll never know. But everyone else calls it Blue Frank or Blue French. Sorry, let's be accurate here. Yeah.
Cool. So then the last bit I wanted to touch on and kind of going on the book that kind of your first book was Amber Revolution. It is an orange wine book. I do have a personal pet peeve that I always try to explain to people about what orange wine is, and I think you wrote a really enlightening article on the Morning Claret recently. Can you just touch on couple points about how orange wine is just a technique and its approach to winemaking, but it's like it has nothing to do with the flavor profile that will come out of the wine, and all of that information.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is definitely it's such a big misconception, and I think it's maybe because, I mean, orange wine is the biggest point of difference when people are making natural wine sometimes, because the idea of fermenting white grapes with the skins, it hasn't been a thing in mainstream wine production ever really. So I think when people started rediscovering this technique and realizing actually there's no reason why we shouldn't use the skins in white grapes, then that really became adopted by the natural wine community, and then suddenly everyone just runs with it and gets completely the wrong idea, and they get the idea that the most extreme style of orange wine that you can think of, something that's really tannic and extracted and weird and cloudy and volatile, and suddenly that becomes the poster child in entirely the wrong way for orange wine and for natural wine, and then people conflate the two. So I think this is the problem, and my message has always been, this is just the forgotten fourth combination, really. If you can make red wine fermented on the skins, then there's no reason why you can't make white wine fermented on the skins. And how it turns out stylistically and flavor-wise can be a million ways on the choices that the winemaker makes, depending on how the world it's made in. And to me, yeah, it's weird when people say, well, I don't really like orange wine because they all taste like cider. And then usually I ask, well, how many have you had? And then usually people say, well, one.
Yeah.
And I think, well, okay, would you judge white wine after you'd had one or two? And to me, orange wine really, it really is, it is as big a category and as varied a category as red, white, or rosé. I think it's so broad these days. It can encompass any style you want. It can encompass cleaner, dirtier, more aromatic, less aromatic, more classic, less classic. It's just, yeah, it can be anything and everything. So yeah, it's hugely frustrating when people judge the orange wine category based on some strange idea that was probably being served a badly made natural wine in a bar somewhere, and then they've somehow got it into their heads that that's the category.
Yeah. Yeah. I have I have less of an issue on, at least where I live, and coming on highly tannic orange wines. It's more like once some of these wines started gaining a little bit of popularity, I feel like every California winemaker just produced a version of a wine that has like a slight tint to it. And a lot of my friends who are seriously into wine, well, more like collectors, they don't work in wine, but they would be like, orange wine's not a serious wine. It's not something that's meant to, there's no complexity. It's not meant to age, can't develop. There's just, kind of Gatorade here. And then I have a lot of other friends on the other side who are just looking for Gatorade. They think it's just kind of like a poundable rosé that they all just basically taste the same, like getting
Yeah.
a rosé from a medium producer in Provence. So it's kind of hard. I've been straddling the line of trying to tell some people they can be serious, other people that there's more to it than just this simple wine. But I think our podcast listeners heard me talk about the wine I had at my wedding, but the fact that wine had so much depth and complexity, and I had a friend who, only drinks, like Peter Michael and things like that from Sonoma. And then I showed that wine to him and he was blown away. There is this ability for these wines to kind of run the quality spectrum, and something for all occasions, and the ability to age fantastically as well if made
Well,
correctly in
yeah, I mean,
the right region.
why should it be any different than any other category in wine? That's what I mean. A question that people ask me a lot is they say, well, what makes good orange wine? And I say, well, really all you're asking me is what makes a good wine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not looking for anything different in orange wine than I would be in red wine or red white blends, you name it. What makes a good wine is balance, elegance, interest, complexity, whatever you might be looking for. So, and why should it be any different just because it happens to be white grapes fermented on the skins? So yeah, I don't know what people do get this weird idea into their heads that it's some strange exotic thing that has to be assessed and judged separately. And for me, it really doesn't. It's just wine, like everything else.
Yeah. And if it has the right components to age, if it has the acid, and in some cases, if it has the tannin, the phenolics, of course it'll develop over time. It has, the building blocks.
Exactly.
But awesome. Well, this has been so great to have you. Really appreciate you kind of sharing everything with us. Before we go, is there you want to just say the names of your books, where people can find them, and then also the Morning Claret again?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think, obviously, please do subscribe to my site. I'm publishing weekly. If you're a paying subscriber, you get all the weekly stuff. You get all the good stuff. If you're a free subscriber, you get something roughly once a month. But yeah, I'd love to see everyone come there, themorningclaret.com. And there is information on my site about my 2 books so far, Amber Revolution, the first one that you mentioned, and Trodden, which is the one about Portugal. So yeah, it's all there on my site, and we'll see some of your listeners there.
Awesome. Are you working on anything else? Is there any other books in the offing?
There are, but it's a slow process at the moment. So that there will be the plan is for at least another 3 books. I can't give a timeline, and I'm not going to say what they're going to be about because I'm just always busy keeping the show on the road,
Awesome. No, perfect. Well, everybody will stay tuned then. We'll anxiously await those.
Yeah,
but thank you so much, Simon.
Pleasure. Thanks.
All right. That was our interview with Simon J. Woolf, presented again by Corbin. With Corbin, you can discover the differences between different varietals, regions, or harvests with side-by-side tastings. That's actually my preferred use of the Corbin system. So go out, find some orange wines, just some natural, well-made wines. I really implore everybody to find some Portuguese wines. Try to buy a variety that you don't recognize. It's pretty easy from there, and you will not be disappointed. Some of the best value wines. But that is our episode for this week, and we will be back with another episode next week. Cheers.